are back with the Hubscale podcast, where we dive into the minds of security leaders all around the world. This week, we have Andre Cuenin, the Chief Revenue Officer at Veracode. Lots of topics to unpack today and super excited to dive into them. Andre, it's great to have you on.
Hey, Elliot, it's fantastic. Good to see you this morning. My morning, your afternoon.
Yeah, no, definitely. So I guess for everybody listening to the podcast, Andre, give a quick introduction to yourself.
Yeah, listen, Andre Cuenin, I'm based in Denver, Colorado. I always joke sometimes you hear my Colorado accent. Joking aside, I grew up in Switzerland. I moved here about 20 years ago. And listen, I've been in IT and technology sales, for more than 2 decades now, right? I've done many different roles. I worked for a startup. I worked for a couple of private equity companies. I also worked for 3 public companies. So a lot of experience in different size of organizations and also different technology areas. More recently, I've been focusing on cybersecurity, which is obviously a super hot topic, with it's kind of, the new frontier of crime, so to speak, right? And Veracode, which I joined about 8 months ago, is focusing on application security. We call it intelligence software security. Intelligent because it's machine learning powered with a real use case. And we call it software because these days it's not just about applications, right? Because you have infrastructures, code, in many different areas. So that's a little bit about myself. Live here with my beautiful wife and our kids. And, Denver is a beautiful place. 300 sunny days a year. So a lot of people don't know
that. 300 sunny days a year. That's not... I did not know that either. We're in Dubai, you get probably 364 sunny days a year. So
yeah, it's hard to beat where Elliot lives.
Yeah, no, definitely. But I want to take it back a little bit. You mentioned there startups, public companies, private equity-owned companies. Just take me a little bit back from the journey from when you was in Switzerland. Just a quick run through of that journey.
Okay, good. Listen, I originally did computer science. I was a software developer, right? Where I saw like a mile deep and not much left and right. And I felt like, hey, I want to be a little bit wider. So I joined my first American software company, which was at the time CA Technologies. And I started actually as a solution engineer, right? So as an SA. And, over a career of 15 years, had many different roles, sales roles, channel. I led the channel at one point in Europe. I ran some regions, and then I moved to the States running the Rocky Mountains. So CA helped me to relocate to the States. And my wife is from Fort Lauderdale, so we moved to the States then. And after 15 years of CA, I did a startup, which was sold to HP. I joined a public company out of Australia for about 10 years and run their US and EMEA business. And then, worked for a couple of private equity firms, Sharewell Software, then Rapid7 a couple of years, obviously public company based in Boston and now Veracode. So super excited about it.
Yeah, no, definitely. I've known Veracode for a while. We've done lots of work in the AppSec world. It's a really cool space to be in. So super exciting. But Andre, you and I have known each other for a few years, right? And we always, you always talk about the principles of success that you kind of live by and have learned throughout all the years as well. So I'd love for you to dive in, especially starting the podcast, to dive into your principles of success.
Yeah, listen, absolutely. It's one of my favorite topics, right? I would like to start with, right, when you go to market leader, right, I'm a big believer of something called control the controllables. And what does that mean? It's always what you sell, and what you sell at any point in time is kind of given. Obviously, you have a roadmap and additional capabilities come in the future, but what you have today is what you have today. What's 100% in your own control, going back to control the controllables, is how you sell. The messaging, the sales methodology, and the processes around it, right? So, and that's why I'm a big believer, right? When you wake up in the morning, you want to work on stuff that you can influence versus potentially maybe, complaining about stuff that's outside of your control, right? Guess which one is the happier person? And, which one is the believer and which one is the passionate person? And, that comes through when you interact with prospects or customers. So, control the controllable, focus on how you sell, is important. And then, there's a few other things I really like. I have this saying, there's no traffic jam on the extra mile. What does that mean? If you do a little bit more than your competitor, or be more reliable, under promise, over deliver, right? Simple things are critical to differentiate yourselves. How you follow up from a customer meeting. Are you able to paraphrase what you learned and really explain the value you can add? And, be thoughtful that the customer realized somebody listened, somebody understood, and somebody also, acknowledges if there is no fit. Because, sales sometimes has a hard time to say no. And, given I have a little bit more technical background, solution fit is super important for me. So no traffic jam on the extra mile is a good one. I also like to say selling starts when you hear a no. But if you haven't heard a no yet, because at one point in the sales process, it's going to happen, you're going to get some objections. And it's how do you overcome them? How do you handle them? And how do you really play to your strengths? But also how do you find a mutually good outcome, right? To your point, sometimes you're in an opportunity and you hear a no and you realize, hey, the customer is making a big mistake and they really should go with you based on requirements. And then, the conviction will at times help to turn this around. And sometimes you hear a no and you realize, hey, the logic of the customer made sense and you move on, right? But hey, there is situation. I have many of them in my professional career where you heard a no, and that's where you turn things around. And those are some of the best relationships I have from the past, because the customer remembers those as well. Because you help them to come to a better outcome. Yeah. So those are a few things. The other piece I really like to talk about is radical candor. And I'm not sure, Elliot, did you read the book from Kim Scott about radical candor?
I didn't, but it's on my list to read. Yeah.
I'm telling you this since 2 years, my friend, right? To read. But anyway, joking aside, radical candor basically means you got to find a way in any possible situation to provide feedback in a constructive way. So with empathy, but some directness. And, different cultures have more comfort doing this. Right? You look in the US, right? It's a little bit the world of the superlatives, the world where everybody's great and a pat on the back. I'm from Germanic Europe, where being a little bit more direct is much more part of the DNA. So combining both things that really helped me in my career, right? Because people looking for coaching, people looking for feedback, they just don't want to hear, hey, you did this great, that great. They also want to hear what they could do better. So that's where the radical candor comes in. And last but not least, and then I stop here to see whether you have any follow-on questions, is how can you align the team, the go-to-market team and the product team, that you're aligned in strategy, execution? I call this one team, one fight. If everybody's in the boat rowing the same direction at the same cadence, you can be extremely powerful. And, that's one of, my big beliefs as well. Bring the team together to have mutual understanding on the why, so then we can, execute on the what.
Yeah, I think that's super exciting, because that's going to tie into the next topic a little bit as well, especially in regards to the last one. But just taking it back to what you mentioned, kind of about the radical candor side of things, I always find it super interesting to dive into stuff like this, because when you're building a global team, every conversation is slightly different, right? Because it depends if you're working in Japan or you're working in the US or Eastern Europe. It's always a little bit different. So how do you kind of manage that on a global scale? That's a beautiful question, and interestingly enough, I was in Japan, maybe was it a year ago or so, and I actually spoke about radical candor and did the whiteboard and talked about it. Different cultures have different, I would say, comfort level with doing it, but everybody agrees, right? As long as you show empathy, right? Feedback can be very constructively delivered, and people are hungry for feedback, really independent of culture. And, especially if you're in a one-to-one situation, you should be able to overcome, any kind of cultural nuances. And there's obviously clear differences, right? The way the Japanese make decisions versus maybe, in North America, there's different dynamics that go in there. But I think the radical kind of concept by principle still applies, but you obviously want to talk about it. You don't want to generalize it, and you want to see what works and how you might have to tweak it based on the culture and the region you're in. Yeah, that makes sense. I love your mug there as well. You're drinking out of. Well, listen. This one I actually took out of the cabinet for you. I'm not sure whether you can see it, but
So,
No, yeah.
see, look, this and the name Dubai. So I was in Dubai a few years ago, so I called that one. So I thought, given your day, let me take this cup out. It's more.
No, love it indeed. But no, taking it back. I think what you mentioned there about radical candor is awesome. Because it's so true as well. But moving it on to kind of the next stage, because I'm super excited about this topic, Andre, because I live and breathe hiring on a day-to-day basis all over the world. So speaking to somebody like yourself and diving into this is awesome. But tell me about your hiring best practices.
Yeah, listen, this is a good question. And, over time, my view has evolved here a little bit. But, I think, first of all, when you're hiring, it always starts kind of with the leadership team, right? So making sure, the leadership team is obviously aligned from a cultural point of view and also from a skill, the skills and the experience you need. But also, from an attitude point of view, right? We have the skill will matrix, which you probably have heard about. So, but first of all, it's about the leadership team. Then the other piece is, just from an overall resourcing model, you want to have a balanced investment model, right? Because what I've seen, and what I mean with this, hey, how many, account executives you need versus, solution engineers, maybe versus BDRs versus channel versus marketing. And you want to have a balanced approach there early on. And then you want to prove out the model, right? What I have seen sometimes happening, especially, if there is very aggressive growth goals, that sometimes company overhire capacity and then, haven't really figured out the repeatable model, meaning, hey, I'm putting an additional, additional headcount in. Do I have a predictable model when I can expect return? And if you haven't proven that model yet, that's where the mix comes in. Hey, maybe it's better to hire a BDR or an SA versus the next salesperson based on, the solution, the sales process, and the dynamics of the market as well. So that's a big piece for me. So you want to kind of prove the model and then put fuel on the fire, right? But you need to see at least pockets of success and say, hey, if we do those 3 things or 4 things repeatably, we're going to be successful, right? So that's what I would say there. And then in terms of hiring, the hiring best practices from a skill point of view, right? You want to obviously have the skills, but we're also super aware is, sometimes attitude is more important than the skill. So if I would, and sometimes you don't find the perfect candidate, you might, hey, this person has really high skill, but this other person, has really high will and maybe needs to learn a little bit more. If I need to make a compromise, always go for the will side. Does somebody have the right attitude and the willingness, to learn, adjust, improve, and take feedback, right? So that's a big one for me. And then, the one thing that, I realize is becoming more and more important is sellers need to be comfortable handling the technology stack. Intent data, customer technographic information, right? There's so many technology tools that are surrounding the go-to-market effort. You need to have people are comfortable with this and are able to deploy this, because I do believe that the technology stack itself nowadays is a competitive advantage itself, and you want sellers who are able to take advantage of that. So that's what comes to mind. Now, the last thing, and I'm sure you agree with this, you need to have a really strong talent acquisition partner, right? Some companies have it in-house. Some company, work with you, Elliot, companies like you with Upscale, and you and I worked together in the past. So, and what's important there is alignment on skill, but also cultural fit. And, a little bit in the beginning, maybe an iterative process to calibrate with a few profiles. Hey, we're on the same page. And that blind alignment, I would say, between the talent acquisition partner and, the hiring manager is super critical, right, to be effective. And also being able to make decision at speed, right? Because good candidates are typically not on the market too long. So you also want to be able to execute, at speed and with confidence.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure whether it makes sense, but those are a few things that come to mind.
Yeah, no, it does. I actually want to touch back on something you mentioned there about attitude. When you're interviewing people, it's great to go through a process, and obviously they speak to multiple people all the time, right? But how do you look for and how do you measure the attitude, the will from an interview process? Obviously, you can do references, but what is it that you look out for?
Yeah. I mean, listen, attitude for me is, does somebody put the work in, right, in the interview process? And, that is simple things like, hey, is the follow-up email, is it crisp? Is it just, a quick thank you, or is it not even an email received, right? Or is it actually paraphrasing what I learned? Is the person listening or able to paraphrase it and go a little bit the extra mile, what I said before, by differentiating themselves from others? The other piece I've done, and partially, is maybe testing the candidates, but also my own time. Sometimes I do an interview over the weekend to see, because I know this will be required at times, not all the times, but at times, we need to jump on a call off hours and, go the extra mile. So that's another good example. So that's what I would say, right? So there's plenty of ways you can test this during the interview process as well. And, it comes through. It comes through also on the way people act in the interview, what they say, how they say it. So, but it's a good question. It's not something you can just ask 5 questions, then you have the answer, right? It's behavioral.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. I remember you and I taking a call. I think it was the day before Christmas Eve. We was talking a few things. It was a couple of years back now, but no, that makes complete sense. But
and we closed the deals, right? We closed the deals, right?
We did indeed, yeah.
I remember. I had like you and I started together for one opening, and then we filled 3 roles together, right? So you had a great pool of candidates, and we accelerated, and that was actually a good example at the time, because I remember one role we were kind of contemplating should invest there. But then once we had the candidate you brought, right, they accelerated the business case, and we pulled the trigger on a segment that I maybe had thought maybe a quarter later. So that was a kind of opportunity met strategy, so to speak.
Yeah. Yeah, no, definitely. He's taking the opportunities as well, isn't it? Which is awesome. And I also like to talk about that, because everything you mentioned there kind of ties into the culture of a business, right? So tell me about, number one, when you're hiring, how do you look out for a culture, rather than not just the attitude, but the culture of fitting into Veracode, for example? But then also, how do you roll that out kind of worldwide?
Yeah, listen, I think the culture piece also has to do by talking to not just one person, right? So you want to have an interview panel of a few people to get a good cross-pollination of roles to be able to assess the candidate, and also the candidate to get a sense of the culture. And what I'm a big believer in, I look at an interview process as a calibration exercise, because both the company and the person are making an important decision, right, in their career or for the company strategy. And what you want to make sure is there's good alignment on good sides. So, I think we spoke about radical candor before. Radical candor is even more important in the interview, because, if you get it wrong on either side, right, then it's obviously, it costs money and it costs time. And, I'm a big believer, you want to be very transparent with a candidate on what they're going to encounter when they join, right? The good and the challenges, right? You don't want anybody to have a surprise, but same expectations from the candidate. Hey, what are really their strengths and what are their weaknesses, right? I love the question about, hey, even if it's a little bit, stereotype, hey, what are the top 5 strengths in the context of the opportunity, right? Because people have many strengths, but in the context of the opportunity. But then also, what are your weaknesses, right? Because, I like to tell candidates, hey, listen, right now we don't know each other so well, but let's say we start working together. In 6 months, I don't only know your strengths you told me all about, but I also will understand your weaknesses. So in full transparency, what would they be? And sometimes they struggle to come up with an answer, and I typically tell them to go back and ask their significant other, because they typically know very well.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. That makes sense. I like it a lot. And just kind of on that piece as well, driving high performance worldwide. I want to touch on this, because your experience is amazing. You've been through every single area of the business and size of companies. But how do you actually drive performance, especially from the sales and SAs and things like that all over the world?
Yeah, listen, whether good or bad, right? Sales is the one organization that's the easiest to measure. It's easier to measure sales performance than maybe a developer on, how much innovation they drive. That's a little bit more, harder to measure. it's possible, and I've seen it at companies done very successfully. But so on sales, the metrics are relatively easy, right? And then what I always look at is, leading and lagging indicators, right? So let's say I hire a new person and that person starts, and after new hire training, obviously what I would like to see is activity, right? And activity with the right messaging drives pipeline. Okay, then you would like to see pipeline. And then obviously, pipeline and sales process drives closed business. And then you can start measuring closed business and forecast accuracy. So those are kind of 4 things I like to measure on a high level: activity, pipeline, bookings, and forecast accuracy. Now, bookings and forecast accuracy is a trailing indicator, right? But, activity and pipeline is a leading one. So you will find out relatively early somebody actually doing what you expected to do. And it also helps with coaching, right? Does somebody need more messaging coaching? Does somebody need more deal process and sales process coaching? Or, have we made the wrong call and the person is not working out? So I think high performance culture is measuring the performance. And then if somebody's not performing, coaching them up, or at times making a change. Because what I found out is when you keep non-performers around, it demotivates your top performers, right? It really does. So it's important also for, I would say, the health of the organization to drive that high performance culture to sometimes make difficult decisions.
Yeah. No, that makes complete sense. And you're so right about kind of letting the low performers out of the business, because it does bring everybody down in the entire business, which I've felt throughout my career, and even in HubScale as well. We've had to do a few things, which is interesting. But I guess in terms of kind of taking it back to the hiring side, you and I have obviously worked together on some executive roles, but I think that the position itself for hiring executive talent all over the world is different than hiring a sales rep, right? Or an AE. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on executive talent, hiring processes, things like that as well.
Yeah, listen, as we said at the beginning, when you said, hey, what are the hiring best practices and how do you scale teams? Is like, it always starts with leadership, right? So, I don't think necessarily the process itself is very different, but you obviously have different skills and experience levels that you're looking for. You have a different interview panel. What's super important for me on the leadership is that you obviously have also some cross-functional people on the interview panel, right? For example, if I'm looking for a sales leader and I know they will need to work with the SA or the customer success leader or marketing, have those people part of the panel to validate the cultural fit and how people can work together. That what comes to mind. But it's obviously, the executive bench is super critical and important. You want to make sure to get those hires right, and sometimes, it's better to wait to get the right talent versus maybe to compromise, to make a compromise. And, sometimes people ask me, hey, when do you want to fill that role, right? And my standard answer is as fast as possible, as late as necessary. Most important is we find the right person, right? Because if you have to wait a quarter to get the right leader, it pays off versus pulling the trigger on somebody that maybe in a year you have to make a change.
Yeah. That makes complete sense. It's actually super insightful as well, because I feel like in the hiring industry, people just pull the trigger a little bit too early sometimes, and then they pay the price in 6 months when they have to do another change and things like that as well. So no, definitely good advice there, Andre. So taking it to the next topic, I think I'd love to hear just your overall advice for sales professionals, sales leaders, people climbing up in their career. It'd be great to hear some advice from you as well.
Yeah, so kind of talking like career advice or
yeah, just everything in general for people.
Yeah. I mean, listen, right? In the end of the day, and I go back to the controllables, the way you go about it is in your control, right? How you do it and what you do is in your control. So what I think is super critical, when you're in a go-to-market function, or actually in any function for that matter, you want to, if you want to have a career, you got to show proactiveness, right? You can't wait around to get served everything, right? You're proactive and asking for stuff to kind of drive your own success. Obviously, a good new hire program will give you already a lot of things that you need, but you got to be proactive, right? You got to make things happen. versus, waiting things happen to you. You got to be hungry to learn, I think, is the other key piece. And, I mentioned technology stack before, right? Hungry to learn means, hey, if I'm a more, experienced salesperson that might not have grown up with all those technology tools, hey, I want to make sure I learn them and I'm good at them because I know it's a competitive differentiator these days, right? So kind of always stay at the leading edge of technology and what's possible. Then, what's always helpful, find mentors, right? The mentors could be in your organization, could be outside of the organization, somebody that at times you can run important decisions or get feedback in a situation, and I remember early in my career, when I was offered a job where I said, wow, this is a big jump upwards, right? You can actually do that job, and I asked a few people, and some people say, hey, be careful, you don't want to be burnt out. And other people say, hey, man, absolutely, go for it, right? And that helped me then to make a decision in that particular circumstance. You want to have some mentors you can, get honest feedback from, right? It's about, it goes back to radical candor, really honest feedback. And sometimes it's okay to hear a no, right? But you want to hear, the advice. And then the other piece, I would say, it's good to have an overall plan, but be fluid, right? I mean, I never thought, I would move to the States when we moved to the States, right? I mean, it's like, but it came about, the circumstance, and then, okay, once I was convinced, I made it happen, right? So I think the other piece, stay fluid, as opportunities come up and take advantage of it at that time, right? So, but don't desperately look for the next thing. Do a good job now, and then the next things will come up. That's what I have seen in my career.
Yeah, I think it's great advice. I just want to touch on the mentorship piece again, because obviously there's a lot of people in this industry, and I think sometimes people do struggle with finding a mentor. So what would you say to people looking for a mentor? How do you go about finding one, and who is it that you would actually trust to listen to rather than just taking advice of kind of anybody, really?
Yeah, obviously, you need to have a certain amount of trust for somebody to do a mentor, right? You need to be able to be vulnerable, so to speak, right? To speak about maybe your concerns or what or the plans or desires. And what I would say is, a lot of times it's people you worked with. It could be in a previous company, a current company. So the network obviously gets bigger over time. That's what I would say, right? So it's important to have kind of that trusted relationship. But I've also seen in companies, we did this in the previous company very successfully, where you build mentorship programs. You pair somebody, right, with somebody that wants to advance their career to get a different perspective. For example, go-to-market person, is paired with a product person that's a senior leader, or maybe, a customer success person or marketing, whatever it might be, to maybe also learn a new dimension and look at things more holistically as well.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then just on that note, I know you mentioned, I did another podcast with, I think it was the third episode or fourth episode, and we was talking about the career journey. You mentioned earlier in the podcast, you started off as a solution engineer, you moved into channel, you've done all the sales side of things as well. So how important do you think it is for maybe somebody in early stage in their career to try out different functions, to maybe get a more holistic thing, to be promoted to a CRO one day?
Yeah, it's a good question. And, you obviously, Noel, have hired a lot of people and saw a lot of careers, so interested in your view as well. But I think there's not necessarily just one way. Obviously what helped me, I had a technical background, but I also had some sales DNA. So it kind of makes sense to go this route. It doesn't have to be that way, right? I mean, there's been very successful CROs who were in the sales career their entire lives. Other people might have had different different aspects of it. I don't think there's, one simple way, but definitely, if you can, especially early on in your career, maybe try a few different things also for your own sanity to know, hey, this really excites me, or this I really want to do, right? Because sometimes early in career, people might not know yet, what, where they're going to end up or what makes most sense for them. And it's always good to assess your skills. And, I'm a big believer in, when you go through schools, you learn stuff, right? And then you realize certain areas you have strengths and certain areas you have weaknesses. And younger in your life, you can overcome the weaknesses by learning more, and then, they might become strengths or at least be neutralized. But after a certain age, right, you really want to double down on honing your strength, but be aware of your weaknesses so that you can have either peers or maybe people in your team or your boss help you to compensate the weakness versus trying to become perfect. I'll give you an example. Obviously I grew up in Germanic Europe, in Switzerland. My English is not perfect, right? I have an accent and, it's my third language, but it's good enough to conduct business, etc. and so forth. I could have now worked on perfecting my English, or maybe don't have an accent, or go to a vocal specialist, whatever, or say, hey, listen, this part is what it is, right? And leverage as an advantage. I can maybe be a little bit more direct than maybe others, right? That's a very practical expansive of leveraging your strengths. And because, if you're leveraging your strengths, you also have more fun in your role, right? But you need to be aware where you need help, etc. and so forth. So not sure whether that makes sense, but, those are a few thoughts that come to mind.
Yeah, it does. No, definitely does. No. Well, to be honest with you, Andre, we're heading towards the end of the podcast here. But
are you telling me I'm talking too much?
I love it, honestly. I love it. But I always like to leave on one question. I know we were speaking about this before, but I didn't tell you the question. So if you had to go back to the beginning of your career, what would you tell yourself?
That's a good one. Hindsight 2020, right? I probably would have moved to the States earlier, to be honest, right? There's so much opportunity here. I love the American spirit. I always tell people, I'm now a dual citizen, but I'm American at heart. I still sound like European, right? But I love the American, culture, belief, thinking big, making things happen, being positive overall, right? So maybe that's what I would say. But otherwise, I always had fun in what I did, and I think that's the big piece, right? For me, the job was never a job, right? It was always more a passion, which I think is super critical. I don't think we could, work as hard and be as dedicated as we are without that element in my mind. But, that's maybe the one thing that comes to mind. I think the other piece I would tell people is, I have both, from an education point of view, a technical background as a computer, with computer science, but then also at one point did an MBA. But I waited till in my early 30s to do an MBA when I already had a certain amount of responsibility, that I was able to apply what I learned in that context. Sometimes people may be taking the next degree maybe too early and they can't apply it yet. So anyway, that's what worked for me. But yeah.
Yeah. No, I like it. Really good advice. I think enjoying what you do and having a passion for something is key. And I like what it ties into trying different things when you're starting out in your career, because you actually don't know what your passion is maybe as well. So no, good advice as always, Andre.
Yeah, no, exactly. After quite a few quarters of, delivering on forecasts and running till the last minute to drive the numbers, I wonder, hey, maybe I could have chosen a job as a little bit less pressure. But on the other side, I love the pressure as well. And nothing feels better when, overachieve the number and, the team makes an impact and drives the business forward.
Yeah, it sure does. Well, Andre, it's always a pleasure speaking to you, and thank you for coming on the podcast again. Maybe we can do one in a few years' time as well, or maybe next year. But thank you for coming on, and appreciate it.
Hey, listen, Elliot, it was a pleasure, and you have a fantastic day. Thank you so much.